This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. Ollie Hicks and George Bullard kayaked from Greenland to Scotland. Their 22-foot tandem sea kayak was customized to allow them to lay flat in the cockpits and rest during the long crossings. From Greenland, they paddled to Iceland, then made their way along its northern coast before starting the 4-day and 4-night paddle to the Faroe Islands in a notorious stretch of water known as the Devil's Dance Floor. During their final crossing to Scotland, exhausted and with a closing weather window, they stopped short at North Rona, the most remote island of the British Isles. After a short weather delay, they landed on the coast of Durness, Scotland after 6 weeks and 1,200 miles of paddling. You can learn more about the Greenland to Scotland Challenge, as well as Ollie's other adventures at his website, olliehicks.com. Ollie Hicks, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thanks, Paul. Good to be here.
Ollie, I looked through your website and checked out some of your other adventures, and you had quite a few of them. Most of them were based in the water and not on land, and I wanted to ask you, what is it that attracts you more towards the water-based adventures?
I think I've been drawn to the water ever since I was a small boy. You know, we grew up, we had a holiday home on the east coast of England, and there was a boating lake there. And so from a pretty young age, we had access to this lake. And on that lake, you could hire rowing boats or kayaks or canoes, sailing boats. And it was only a shallow lake. So we were allowed to sort of run free on this lake, you know, without any of the constraints you have nowadays of health and safety and no life jackets and, you know, just no supervision. And I think that must have been pretty formative in my love of the water, you know, whether that's being on it, in it, or under it. So both a sort of love of the water and a love of boats and messing around on boats. And I guess I was then drawn to big ocean adventure when I found out about ocean rowing when I was 13 years old. My father cut a clipping out of the newspaper, out of the Times, an article about Peter Bird, who is one of the sort of forefathers, I guess, of modern ocean rowing. And he was lost rowing across the Pacific in 1996. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of ocean rowing or the sport. And I decided that, I was absolutely, from that moment on, I was obsessed and I was voraciously reading anything I could find on the topic. And I guess it just snowballed from there. Having been obsessed with the Atlantic, then it became this idea I had on the Atlantic to row around the world. And, you know, that remains my obsession to this day. And I'm working on that project more or less as we speak.
Another thing that caught my eye was that you had worked on some National Geographic filmmaking projects, and I wondered, you know, what were those and what was that experience like for you?
That's right. I did work on a National Geographic film project in Antarctica. It was part of part of a series called Ocean's 8, and it was a series of documentaries using kayaks to explore different parts of the ocean which are most vulnerable to climate change. And it was made by a well-known guy in the States called John Bowermaster. This was the Antarctic episode. So we were down, I was working on a yacht as a second mate, and we were sailing down in the Antarctic Peninsula trying to document climate change. Ironically, there was the original idea was to circumnavigate James Ross Island, which had never been done before. And unfortunately, that year, there was too much ice, so the team couldn't paddle around it. So we did a traverse of the length of the Antarctic Peninsula instead, finding examples of the climate change going on firsthand.
In the Greenland to Scotland Challenge, there's kind of sort of a mystery, and that is, on your website, you refer to it as the Wake of the Finmen. Can you explain what that is?
That's right. Sorry, it's a little bit confusing or obscure perhaps, but the project was initially called The Wake of the Finmen because that's where the inspiration came from. The Finmen were supposedly Inuit who'd come all the way from Greenland, and Finmen was really their mythical name because these guys were sighted off the Northern Isles of Britain. So they were seen in Shetland and Orkney and northern Scotland and Ireland. And they were dressed, they were in kayaks. So they are they are quite unusual looking things, especially if you've never seen a kayak. Imagine a man dressed in skins in a skin boat. You could easily be forgiven for mistaking them for some form of half man, half seal, or half sea creature. The locals thought that these people or these creatures had come from Finland or Finnmark. Finnmark is northern part of Norway, which would make sense sort of geographically speaking. And so there's hundreds of years of these sightings and these myths generated. But then in 1728, the first hard evidence came of one of these Finmen being washed up on the beach in Aberdeen in 1728. And nobody knows where he came from or how he got there. There's a book called Searching for the Finmen, and that explores all the various theories around who they were and how they may have come to be on British shores or European shores. In 1728, that was the first hard evidence. And the Inuit was found. He was still alive. He died subsequently, 3 days later. But all his gear is still in the museum in Aberdeen. So, there is hard evidence that they did get there. And the mystery, as you say, is how did they get there? And so our expedition set out to prove that potentially they could have paddled that route.
It seems, from what I've read, that it took you 4 or 5 years to prepare, and at least a year ahead of time you would quit your job so you could focus on it full time. What were you doing? What was your job?
Basically, I was running expeditions full time, rowing expeditions. I'd done the Atlantic in 2005, and then that turned into a full-time job for an attempt to row around the bottom of the world in 2009, which didn't work out. That was a failure, really. On returning from that project, I was trying to raise the sponsorship to go again, but I couldn't raise the money. And so I took a regular job in London, and initially as a headhunter, recruiting sort of people into financial services mainly. I did that for about a year and a half, and then switched to running the fuel team for a biomass energy company. We were building wood-fired power stations, and because I had a bit of a background as a forester and a tree surgeon, the company wanted someone who knew about trees and how the sort of supply chain worked. And so I did that then for 3 years, all based in the UK. And, I enjoyed those jobs, but I feel that these expeditions are why I'm here. And I should, when it's possible, focus on those. And so this kayak trip, or I suppose the power station company came to a natural conclusion. We'd financed a couple of projects, and I had the opportunity to leave with a bit of money in my pocket, which enabled me to take a bit of time off, and then secured the sponsorship for the kayak trip. And so then I was able to go back to expeditioning full time. I know a lot of people would like to do expeditioning full time, but it's the tough side is the business side, right? And how do you make a living from it? And that is always the toughest part.
Tell me about George and how he came on board the project.
So George came in quite late in the day, really, because as you say, it was a 5-year build-up into the project. I'd made 5 or 6 attempts to cross the North Sea, of which 2 were successful on different routes. And really, they were build-up projects or training projects to understand how you could spend a long time at sea in a kayak. So how do you sleep in a kayak? How do you stay warm enough to sleep? How do you stabilize the boat when you need to rest or you need to sleep? All these sort of fairly mundane things, but they require going through the mill or going through the sort of school of hard knocks to understand how to achieve those things. So it was only really this year that we were ready to take it on. And I was initially due to go with a guy called Patrick Winterton, who I'd done the Shetland bus expedition with in 2013 when we paddled from Shetland to Norway. He had a change in personal circumstances at the end of 2015, so sadly he had to pull out. Then I was, halfway or sort of 70% to getting this project off the ground, and I didn't have a partner. And we had a 2-man, specially made 2-man kayak to paddle. So I knew of George because he'd done a trip on the boat I worked in Antarctica, and I knew his cousin, and he'd also skied across Greenland, and that was something that really attracted me to him in a way, because his mindset to be able to ski across Greenland, turn around and follow your own tracks back in a zero stimulus environment. I thought that's just the sort of mindset you need to be able to do this paddling. It has that same sort of monotony about it. I told George that this was what I was doing, and I was looking for someone, and would he be interested? And he immediately leapt at the opportunity. So it went from there.
Did you do anything special to train yourself, physical trainings and so on?
We're both in pretty good shape anyway, as regards general fitness. And then we did quite a lot of specific training in terms of hours in the kayak. We did a lot of weekend trips out to the Scilly Isles in the southwest of England. But we never did huge mileage. I guess the most we did over a 24-hour period was about 60 miles. And I'd say that was enough. We were in pretty good shape by the time we left. We did a lot of technical training. So how do you recover the boat once it's capsized and swamped? And how do you roll the boat? So that sort of thing, because George hadn't really done any sea kayaking before this trip. So it was a case of getting him up to speed, and he picks things up really quickly. He's a very competent guy. So he went and did a crash course in Cornwall with a guy called Jeff Allen. Jeff sort of coached him one-to-one and got him rolling and self-recovering and everything like that in no time.
Did you guys ever have to use those skills on your adventure?
The skills we used quite a lot were sort of bracing and support strokes. So we never had to roll the boat. We never had to self-recover. But what we did do, and probably the most useful skills, is to keep the boat upright in the first place. So avoiding a capsize. And fairly frequently we were using braces or support strokes when the weather was bad or when we were coming into a surf landing, that sort of thing.
Ollie, tell me a bit more about the kayak.
So the kayak is, broadly speaking, a production, it's based on a production boat, something called an Inuk Duo 6.8 meter, which is a two-man boat made by Inuk Kayaks, a guy called Rob Folloy, who's made kayaks for years. That boat would have been ideal, but it wasn't quite large enough for us to sleep in. So basically we took the mold of that boat, we built an Inuk 6.8, and we took it out of the mold, and we cut it in half, and we added 3 feet into the midsection. And that enabled enough space in the boat for George and I to lie down flat in it. That was the major modification. And then we did things like we added small pumps that you could really get it dry with, which is important before you're sleeping. And we also put in some really big electric bilge pumps, which were specified for a sort of 90-foot boat. And we had 2 of them. So if the boat did get swamped, we could empty her in about 80 seconds. And it was a huge volume of water that would fit in that boat. It would be about a ton. So we could get rid of that very quickly. And then the other big difference, I guess, was these tents that we'd, over the various expeditions I'd done in the past, we'd modified the prototype. So we had a tent which you could get some shelter in. So the tent sort of ties around the cockpit rim, and then it works like a clamshell or a convertible car roof. It concertinas up and down, and you slide down inside the boat, put your head on your seat, and then once you're in that position, you pull up the clamshell and you zip it shut over your head, creating a sort of tent, which is very claustrophobic, but it gets you out of the wind and warms you up. And the kayak is also insulated with about 8 millimeters of insulating foam on the inside. So that gives you some protection from the cold water, some insulation, so you don't get too cold when you're asleep.
I saw the photographs. They show some gray-colored airbags on the side. What do you use those for, and in what circumstances?
So the airbags were our solution to sleep and to make the kayak stable enough when we were sleeping. So we had 2 forward and 2 back, 2 by me and 2 by George. And then if the weather was really bad, we had the sort of last chance saloon was a fifth bag, which would be lashed to the midsection of the deck, which should make the boat more or less self-righting. So that was what we were going to deploy if we met the sort of 50-year storm. But basically, once those airbags were rigged, they gave you good enough stability to be able to sleep and rest without fear of capsize.
Do you have pumps to inflate those?
No, you blow them up by mouth.
What kind of paddles did you use?
We used a Lettmann ocean paddles. Lettmann are a sort of German paddle maker, and they're incredibly high quality. They're very expensive, but they were one of our sponsors, and they provide us with 2 pairs of paddles. And so we had the large version and the small version, and we used the small version throughout. We never used the spares at all, which was testament to their robustness and the quality of how they are made. And they're also adjustable, so that if you were getting a slight twinge or you feel an injury coming on in one sort of in your wrist or your shoulder, you could change the angle of the blades to avoid an injury becoming chronic.
What were the paddles made of?
The paddles were made of woven carbon fiber using I can't remember exactly, but it's a special technique. I think they weave the carbon fiber, infuse it, and then they put it in an oven, which I understand is a different technique to how they're making most other paddles. They're not as light as some paddles, but they're still light enough, and they're incredibly strong, which was critical for us.
You guys also had sails on your boat. Did you get a chance to use those?
Yeah, for sure. Thank goodness for the sails. We loved the sails. They came from a company called Flat Earth Sails, based in Australia, and they a really clever design. They just basically they're attached to the in front of each paddler. They're far enough forward that you can still paddle when they're up. You need to be still paddling because otherwise you get cold. And also they're not really powerful enough to make a better speed if you're paddling and sailing. So we used them, I would say, about 60% of the time we had the sails up. And obviously we would use them as much as possible because the boat was about 250 to 300 kilos fully loaded. That sort of strain on your wrists and shoulders and core over the duration we were paddling, I think would probably have led to injury. And I'd say that the sails went a long way to, or certainly beneficial in neither of us getting injured. And so they don't really increase your top speed, but what they do is give you a higher sustained speed. So, we could flat out paddle that boat at 4.5 knots, 5 knots, but you couldn't sustain that. Our probably sustained paddle speed was about 3 knots or just under. Whereas with the sails, you could sustain probably 4 or just under 4 knots. So we sailed a lot, and they're great, easy to deploy, easy to put away, great bit of kit.
250 to 350 kilograms. Does that include the weight of you and George?
Yeah, that's an all-up weight. That's all our gear, plus the boat, plus us. And the range in that 250 to 300 is probably depending how much water we were carrying. We didn't carry a desalinator. We carried the water in bladders.
How are you navigating when you're out there?
Our navigation was fairly simple. We just used compass and GPS, and mainly compass. So at the beginning of each day, I would chart our bearing or our course for the day, give George the bearing, and he had the pedals. He had the steering pedals in his cockpit, so he was the driver, and he would steer to that bearing. We're using silver compasses, which were excellent, and George did a great job of steering. Every landfall, we hit our target, which I didn't think would be the case before we left. I thought we'd be more affected by wind and currents than we were. And then I'd check the course against the bearing every sort of 5 hours, both to check how much the bearing was changing or altering, so we could see how the currents and the leeway of the wind was affecting us, and also, of course, to check how much distance we'd made. And if we'd made little distance or we'd had a bad session, then I wouldn't tell George, and if we'd had a good session, then I'd tell him.
Just came to my mind. When you're in a tandem kayak, is there any thought process to go to who goes in the front or in the back? Is it the more experienced person, the less experienced person? How do you guys make that decision?
So the front and the back is, to my knowledge, you're meant to have the heavier and the stronger guy in the back. I've done both, but in this instance, it was really dictated because George couldn't fit in because it was a production boat. It is how it is, and so we even when it was stretched, because it was cut in the middle, the longer section was in the middle. So George is about 6'4". I'm only about 5'8". So the only one part of the boat that George could fit in was the back. So it was pretty binary. He had to go in the back, which I don't know if he was sad about, because that meant he had a slightly bigger cockpit, which meant he had the lion's share of chores, including steering and cooking, because there was no room in my cockpit for cooking.
How do you guys get to the starting point?
So to get to the start point in Greenland, we trucked everything up to Iceland. We literally loaded up a Land Rover in London and then drove to Denmark, got on the ferry. Ferry took us to Iceland. We drove across Iceland and we met a yacht in the northeast of Iceland, a yacht called Aurora Arctica, and they run trips up to Greenland and Jan Mayen, adventure trips. And I'd met Siggy, who's the skipper of Aurora, in Antarctica. We'd been sailing down there at the same time, so I didn't know he was running this business, and it was fortuitous when I emailed him and saying would he be able to take us, that I'd met him before. So they did a great job. They run a 60-foot old clipper yacht from the race. So we loaded our kayak onto the deck, lashed it to the rails of the yacht, and sailed due north pretty much out of a town called Isafjorda in the northeast side of the country. And we sailed up with the idea of either hitting the beach in Greenland or hitting the pack ice. And we hit the pack ice, and then they chucked us out, and we started from the edge of the sea ice.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the main sections and the challenges of each of those. So Your Greenland to Iceland portion, 40 hours of paddling as I understand it. What can you tell me about the challenges you faced there?
Greenland to Iceland, we had relatively good. We had very good conditions, I would say. We'd been waiting for a weather window for about a week in Ísafjörður, waiting to go, and it's a really fast changing weather pattern up in the North Atlantic. So occasionally we'd get what looked like a weather window and then it would close out, or it would not develop as anticipated. So by the time we got dropped off, it was flat calm, like a glassy calm. And then it got a bit rougher, but we never had more than a force 5 on that part of the journey, and that's always what we're aiming for. We're aiming for a maximum force 5. Ideally, wind's always on the beam or behind the beam. We don't want to be messing around with headwinds, ideally. And so the ocean legs are like sprints. We're trying to get off that ocean as quick as we can to the safety of land, really. And that pretty well worked out on the Greenland leg. We managed to get quite a lot of sleep, and one night the conditions were so good that we were able to leave our sails set with our floats out, and we just left the sails up. So we were sailing along even while we were sleeping. And I think in about 8 hours sleeping, we made about 15 sea miles. It was the first and only time I think we made that. But that was great. I guess the other challenge on that leg was the cold. So the air temperature wasn't particularly cold, but the sea temperature absolutely freezing. I mean, obviously there were icebergs to begin with, and the sea is sort of burning cold to the touch. It's a very black, sinister bit of ocean. We were working hard, and we have chemical heat packs which we put inside our dry suits to keep us warm. And the other issue we had on that leg quite a lot of fog. As you head south from the ice and the water is warming a little bit, then you're getting big fog banks and up to 10, 15 miles thick. And it was very difficult for George to navigate or to steer in the fog. It's really disorientating. Yeah, it's not a big problem. It's just unpleasant.
Around northern Iceland, what do you remember about that? What were some of the challenges?
So around northern Iceland, I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, I'd recce'd it on Google Earth, and I'd looked at some books about it. I'd done what I could, and I didn't really have a flavour for what it was going to be like. I thought it was going to be more isolated than it was. There's more habitation along that coastline than I thought there would be. And I think the big challenge we had on the north coast of Iceland was that it's almost a bit like ocean crossings, because the sort of jagged nature of the coast means you've got these finger-like peninsulas coming up, and then in between every peninsula or headland, you have often very wide and very deep fjords. So crossing those fjords, often they'd be 40 miles across, and that was really like another ocean leg. And so they're quite boring, those just open water crossings. Whereas actually when you're traveling along the coastline, at the foot of these 300-foot bird cliffs, that's absolutely stunning, and there's loads to look at, and you've got waterfalls coming from the top of the cliff all the way down to the ocean. That's fantastic. But actually the fjord crossings, when you're just looking at the mountains on the horizon for hours after hours, we didn't really enjoy that so much. I guess the other challenge was that we didn't really consider the weather so carefully. I think it was my fault that it hadn't really, because there's the perception of safety because you're near land, but of course that's a nonsense, because you're drowning in a foot of water as well as you will in 2 miles of water. So there were a few times we got caught out in gales. Often it was very sunny, and the sun will drive a very strong sea breeze in the late afternoon once the land is heated up, and the air goes out to sea, then falls down on the sea, and then blasts back into the land. So often we got caught by that, and as a response, we started traveling by night. Obviously, you've got 24-hour daylight, so it didn't really make a problem for us, but we became pretty nocturnal for large sections of the northern coast.
The next section was the big one, Iceland to the Faroe Islands, 280 miles. As I understand it, it was 4 days and 4 nights of paddling. Is that correct?
That's right, 4 days and 4 nights.
And how did that go? What were the challenges on that section?
I think the main challenges for the Iceland to Faroes leg across the so-called Devil's Dance Floor were well, maybe partly the fact that it's called the Devil's Dance Floor is quite intimidating in of itself. That's a formidable stretch of water. It was the longest leg of all our crossings, and therefore we were going to be at sea for the longest amount of time, or so we thought. So I think it's a psychological barrier as much as anything. But it did turn out to be a physical barrier as well, because the difficulty is planning the weather. You cannot see the weather accurately much beyond 2 days, especially in that region of the world. So the first time we set out, we'd already been waiting 3 or 4 days for the weather window to appear, and it did, and it looked pretty good. And we thought we'd have to punch through a couple of days of not so good weather, but on the other side of that, then it was going to be great, and we'd get some tailwinds so we could use our sails. What happened was we punched out into the moderate conditions, no sailing, and quite a sort of choppy sea state, so quite a lot of wind chop on the top of the sea. So that's the sort of wind-driven waves that sit on top of the swell, and that's a problem for a kayak like us, because it creates these little waves, but every time you hit them, they're really slowing you down, and the front of the kayak starts slamming into them. So when you're slamming, your progress is slower. And it's also demoralizing because you're getting waves over your head and into your face all the time. So that's pretty gritty. But we came through the first 48 hours, having slept a couple of nights, and that second morning, woke up and it was a flat, calm, beautiful day, and that's when the good weather was due to kick in. So we started paddling, and we bumped into a fishing boat, a longliner. It was actually the first boat we'd seen in the whole journey up to this point. And they'd seen us and they motored over, and they said, well, what the hell are you guys doing? So we told them we're kayaking back to Scotland. And they're like, you're crazy. And anyway, and they said, well, there's really bad weather coming tonight. Well, that wasn't the information we had from our weather teams. So we were actually a bit dismissive of it. And George and I had a quick conflab, and we decided to carry on going. And then 10 miles down the track, they came after us again, and they're beeping their horn, and they catch up with us. And we're lucky they found us, but they did. And they're like, we really want you to come back with us. This weather's going to be really bad, 40 to 60 knots. We just couldn't believe that, because 60 knots is a hurricane. Anyway, so I was like, okay, guys, can you stand by? And we made a couple of calls to our weather teams, one of whom said, the situation has changed. You need to get on that boat straight away. And the other team said, you can carry on, you're ahead of the weather system. So there we got 5 pieces of advice. We got the Coast Guard saying go back, the fishermen saying go back, and one of our weather guys saying go back. And there's one of our weather teams saying carry on and you'll miss the bad weather. Well, I didn't really trust someone who's looking at a computer screen from a comfy armchair when we're 60 miles out in the middle of the North Atlantic, when the fishermen, these tough Viking fishermen, are telling you there's going to be a hurricane tonight. So it was a sad but not difficult decision to make. And we accepted the lift from the fishermen, and they craned the boat onto the roof, and back we went, back to Iceland, to a little fishing village only about 20 miles down the coast from where we'd started. On the way back, we didn't want to be a burden to the fishermen, so we said, what can we do to help? And so they put us to work on the boat, and we were on the gutting line. We were helping sort out the fishing line and pulling in the fish. And and then it turned out that the fishermen put us up. They had a house in the village, and they let us stay there. But they also gave us work, so we were waiting for the weather, but there was no clear weather window for us to leave for about a week. And so for that week, we spent it working on the fishing boat, long lining for cod. And that was really a highlight of the trip. Something you couldn't have scripted it. Yeah, fantastic guys, fantastic boat, and really great experience. At the end of that week, it looked like the weather was coming good, and so off we went again. And, that trepidation of leaving on an ocean crossing in a tiny boat never leaves you. I'd say your last crossing is as bad as your first crossing. So off we went with some trepidation, and we had to make up the 60 miles that we'd done the previous week. So that was a bit gutting
So hold on a second. So you didn't get dropped back off to where you were at your GPS point. You had to retread the same 60 miles.
That's right. Yeah, and we were a little bit further south on the coastline, but our retread was the same distance, basically. So yeah, we paddled out the whole way. We didn't get dropped off. This time, the conditions were better. We were going out into decent weather, and we didn't have to punch through the first 2 days of bad. And We couldn't sail on the first day, and then the second day we could sail, and then the third day it was very squally on the third day, so we were sort of dodging between rain showers and thunderstorms. And on the fourth day, on the fourth day we saw the Faroes, this extraordinary steep rocky archipelago of islands in the far North Atlantic. Incredible sight, and it was a very calm day. Actually, it was quite a big swell running, but the sea surface was pretty smooth, and it was really warm. It was a lovely sunny day, so we were able to strip our dry suits down to the waist and really enjoy our landfall on Faroes. Of course, as is ever the case, the horizon never gets any closer. It seems like you're paddling at it for hours, for forever, and gradually you start being able to see a little bit more detail on the cliffs and on the land as you get closer. It was dark by the time we came in, which is indicative of the length of the trip, because when we started in Greenland, it had been 24-hour daylight. But by the time we left on this second attempt to get to Faroes, we had about 4.5, 5 hours of darkness by then. And so pushing through those dark, or what we call the graveyard shifts at night, was pretty tough. We were both hallucinating quite a lot. So it was the last night out when we decided not to sleep. We're just going to paddle through the night. And we were looking at this bright light behind us, and George was asking about it, and I was sort of dismissive, and I said, I don't know, it's the sun or something. It's the sun going down or the moon coming up. And anyway, it was moving, and by the time it got a bit closer, we could see it was the ship that runs from Denmark to Iceland, and it was the ferry we'd got out. So we had a moment on the radio. We had a radio conversation with the bridge. It was the mate on the ship, on the Noronha, who we'd been to see about 6 weeks before. And we'd been to talk to him about navigational advice. So we had this bizarre conversation with them as they were steaming back towards Faroes on the VHF, with us just sitting in pitch black with the final sort of 10 miles to paddle into the islands. So that was quite surreal. And we were trying to aim for a small gap in the islands called the Sundini Channel, which bisects the islands north to south, but it's only about a kilometre wide. And so quite a tiny inlet to hit. But once again, someone was smiling on us, and we hit that inlet bang on. And happily, the tide was not running. We hit the tide and the current just right, which was completely by luck rather than judgment. Because if the tide had been against us, it's too strong there to be able to get in. So we would have had to wait another 7 hours for the tide to change to our favour. So in we went into this rocky inlet with huge cliffs either side. It was sort of light enough you could just make out the silhouettes of the cliff. And then this very powerful rib boat came out, which had the Red Bull film crew on board. The skipper of the rib boat, he had beers for us. And my God, they were very welcome. Then we just paddled in, and there was this beautiful, it was still quite dark, so we couldn't quite tell what it was, but latterly we saw it was a beautiful bay, very sandy, and we just landed in a pretty calm sea, not much swell, just gently breaking waves onto this beautiful sand beach. We could hardly walk at this point after 4.5, 5 days in the boat, because you've been sitting down all that time, trying to stumble out of the waves and then drag the boat up the beach when your legs don't really work is quite comical. But we didn't care about any of that. We were just so delighted to have made the Devil's Dance Floor crossing and to be on the solid ground again.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So you're at the Faroe Islands now, and you have to make the final crossing to Scotland. But on the way, you have to pull up short on this small island called North Rona. What did you find when you landed on North Rona? On
North Rona, it had already been part of our plan B that we may have to go there. It was almost like an A- plan, because we really thought we would be likely to go there. And I'd found out from Patrick Winterton, who'd been there before. I knew he'd been there before in a kayak on his way from Scotland to the Faroe Islands in 2008, I think it was. So he knew where you could land, and I had a call with him before we'd left saying, where can we land? And there's really only one place on the island, or maybe a couple of places depending on the swell and the weather. But obviously it's getting hammered by the North Atlantic swell, and there's really no shelter at all. You just have to pick the side of the island which isn't getting hammered. We followed the lighthouse in after it was our third night at sea, and we could see the lighthouse. And so we followed that in as close as we dared, but because of the sort of fearsome nature of the island and the very rocky landings, we didn't want to land in the dark. And with hindsight, there's no way we could have landed in the dark. We would have smashed the boat and been in a world of pain. As dawn broke, so we tried to sleep through that night, but it was getting a bit rough, so we didn't sleep very well. Anyway, as the dawn came up, we paddled into the island the remaining couple of hours. We'd waited about 10 miles out, just drifting around on the sea anchor, then paddled in. First, our judgments must have been a bit warped because we identified a place we thought we could land. But I just said, hang on, let me just go in and check. I'll go and do a recce of other landing places. Because this rock that we were looking at was being swept over by surf, quite regularly. So it was far from ideal. So I swam out and climbed up the rocks and got ashore, and then did a quick sort of scout around the island and found this deep inlet running into a cave where we could land. So I swam back out, joined George in the boat, and then we paddled around to that side of the island. And it was pretty quiet waters in there, so we managed to land and unload the boat. We went into the inlet. Just at the mouth of the cave, there was some sloping rocks where we could get out quite easily and unload the boat. So we unloaded it and dragged it up the rocks, and then sort of once again collapsed onto the rocks and just lay in the sunshine. Once again, glad to be on solid ground. Even if we were not at our end destination, we were still safe. And sure enough, about 2 hours later, it was blowing a gale. And then we were trapped on that island for a further week of basically unrelenting gales. It was blowing up to force 10 for that whole week.
Tell me about this pasta stash that you found.
So as islands go, it was a pretty magic one to be marooned on. And initially we thought there was only a lighthouse there. On the maps, it's only indicating a lighthouse, but there's also a refuge hut. And the refuge hut was open, which was a good start. And also had staple foods like pasta and rice and some sort of tins of curry sauce and all this sort of thing. So we were able to move out of the tent and into the refuge hut. So we passed our last week on the island pretty comfortably, stashed away in the refuge hut, harvesting a few seagulls to add into our pasta or rice and get a bit of protein in. It was pretty magic having this 300-acre island, this sort of jewel in the North Atlantic, all to ourselves.
The weather finally lets up and you head on to land in Durness, Scotland. When you got there, what was the reception like?
Because we'd had quite a lot of false starts when we thought we might get a chance to leave the island. The same in Faroes, we'd had a false start to try and get down to Scotland. And I think, unfortunately, by that point, people were sort of, it's quite a tricky place to get to, the northeast corner of Scotland. And so we had quite a muted reception, I would say. But, we weren't too fussed about the reception. All we were so delighted to just finish the journey and finish it successfully and in one piece. And for me, I'd been 5 years working on the project. I was just so relieved that we'd pulled off this improbable project against the odds. And the people that mattered were there, basically. So my mother was there, and my wife-to-be was there on the beach, and my father. So it was fantastic. And it was a beautiful day. You don't often get good weather in north-east Scotland. But it was 25 degrees, beautiful powder blue skies. And we landed onto this incredible sort of white sand beach. You could have been in the Caribbean. It was absolutely stunning. Except you probably wouldn't have cows on the beach in the Caribbean.
I saw that you had the boat blessed, and I wanted to ask if that's a common thing to do.
I don't know if it's a common thing to do to get the boat blessed, but they do it with ships and cruise liners, I guess. And so we're rather more vulnerable, perhaps, than a big ship. So I have always had my boats blessed, whether that's an ocean rowing boat or a kayak. And I think I'm not particularly religious or superstitious, but on these types of trips, you do become perhaps a little bit more aware of, some people call it the third man, or the outside influences, whether that's fate or luck or God, whatever you want to call it. Look at the pickup from the fishing boat. It was the only boat we'd seen on the whole journey. It was one of the few times it was clear enough when there wasn't fog that they could have seen us and we could see them. And also that the sea was calm at that moment and they were able to recover our kayak. So, it does make you think of that someone's watching you, someone's sort of, on your side. The same when we landed at North Rona, the fact that we found a landing place. So I think getting the boat blessed is just another string to our bow. It's just another sort of weapon in the armory. Every little helps, right? And we need all the help we can get.
Thank you for using the word weapon, because that's a great segue into my next question, which is, you guys brought a rifle. What was the purpose, and did you ever need to use it?
That's right. Expeditions into Greenland are required to carry a rifle. And whilst we weren't really under Greenlandic jurisdiction, but it's pretty sensible to carry a rifle in that region, because there are polar bears and there are walruses. And that's why we had the rifle. That's why we had the weapon for self-defense. It was a cut-down version of a 30-06, so it's quite a big rifle. Very simple bolt action, but it had the barrel cut off, so it was easier to carry on a kayak. And in the end, we didn't actually take it on the kayak. We decided, because there was not that much pack ice, and I thought the bears would be living on the ice, and therefore we wouldn't take it because it was excessive weight. And I thought the risk was the risk meant we didn't need to take it. So we didn't take it, and we got away with it. We were fine, but I was wrong with the supposition of the bears only living on the ice, because a week after we arrived into Iceland, almost in exactly the same place, a polar bear landed, and it had swum all the way from Greenland to Iceland. So rather made our trip look pretty pathetic.
Besides your weather forecasters, who else do you have behind the scenes helping you?
It's a pretty big crew, all in all, involved with the project, and some are way more involved than others. But we had a long list of sponsors. We had 28 sponsors by the time we left. Actually, we probably had more than that, depending how you look at it. But 28 named sponsors in the project, providing everything from financial support to watches to tents to vehicles to communication equipment. You've got Land Rover, Iridium, Virgin. It's a long old list, and they're great. Without them, it doesn't happen. So they are crucial, and it's a huge amount of work to pull that sort of team together to make the project happen. All I do is I've got the idea and I'm driving force, but without those people providing the assets and the finance, we couldn't do it. So that's sort of step one. Once you've got those things in place, then we have our core team, I guess, was we had a couple of doctors who help us with the medical preparations and put the medical kit together and teach us how to use it. And they're also on standby in case there's a crisis. We have a sort of crisis ops room, which is manned by Victoria Nicholson, who's done a lot of work with Walking with the Wounded project and has a business called Chase Expeditions, a sort of expedition consultancy. So she was acting as a crisis management sort of center. If anything had gone wrong, by the Coast Guard, she was really our first point of contact. And then my wife, wife-to-be, was sort of in charge of liaising between the film crew on the ground, the Red Bull film crew who were following some of our trip, and there was a team in London sort of helping to tell the story, as it were, through our website and over social media. So it was a really involved project. Social media has changed the face of how these expeditions communicate now, and that was certainly a really big difference that I noticed since I last did a big expedition in 2009. Long and the short, there's a big team and lots of people involved one way and another.
Who was writing the blog postings?
My wife-to-be was writing those.
I just wanted to comment and say I found it funny when she described your fluorescent eyebrows.
Yeah, she has to live with them.
Ollie, when you look back on it, what was your favorite part?
I think that the two highlights of the trip for me were working on the fishing boat and meeting those guys in Iceland, and also North Rona. Being stranded on North Rona for a week was a pretty unique and special experience that you couldn't really engineer. And of course, finishing the expedition successfully was I guess that was more a relief than anything else. But I think the fishing and North Rona were just fantastic. The sort of unscripted adventure that you cannot really plan for, and Neither of them were in the script, and they just came off. And that's the sort of true boy's own adventure that can come out of these expeditions. And, if we hadn't had that, it would have been quite a flat story almost. We would have just paddled from A to B, and that was that. But it's those episodes, I think, that really add the spice and color to it.
I read that you're doing this in support of the Blue Marine Foundation. What are they?
That's right. The Blue Marine Foundation is primarily working to create marine protected areas around the globe to ensure fish breeding and recovery areas to stand against overfishing. They've had quite a lot of successes recently, and they have a project up in Scotland which we were just trying to draw some attention to, and really it was the beginning of our relationship in a way. But we're looking to work together on my next project, the Row the World campaign, to really try and draw attention to what they're doing. And conceptually, my expedition will be drawing a blue belt around the bottom of the world. And the blue belt is how we now need to see some of these marine sanctuaries. I don't know in the States, but in this country, you have a green belt, which is a sort of sanctuary around urban areas where the developers are not allowed to build into to protect the countryside. And if we can create blue belts around certain islands or critical breeding areas for fish stocks, then that blue belt is prohibited for fishing and allows the fish stocks to recover and remain sustainable. So that's the mainstay of their work, is creating and lobbying for those areas to be created.
For the Greenland to Scotland Challenge, will there be a movie?
Yes, we are making a film about the Greenland to Scotland Challenge. It's being made by Red Bull Media House, and it'll be part of the Explorers series, and it should come out in the spring next year, I believe.
So you were just talking a little bit about your next adventure. What more can you tell us about that, and when's that going to start?
So my next big project, or biggest ever project perhaps, is this solo row around the bottom of the world, starting in late 2017, depending how the funding goes. Fingers crossed we'll get the boat built and away by the end of next year. And it is just that. It's starting in Australia and rowing around the bottom of the world and back to Australia. And there'll be one stop in South Georgia and take on a resupply and overwinter there, because the conditions are difficult to survive in the winter on the Southern Ocean. There's a big risk of ice accretion on the boat, so we stop to avoid that. It's a long project. It's sort of epic in terms of its duration, and it'll be 18 months through the most remote parts of our planet.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more?
Best to contact me just through the website, really, or through our social media channels.
And that is ollyhicks.com, and it's spelled OLLYHICKS.com.
That's spot on.
Ollie Hicks, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling the story. I really appreciate it, and congratulations to you and George on the accomplishment.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for your time.
Recorded September 21st, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.